Amidst rising tensions with the DPRK, U.S. President Donald Trump is fighting a new battle, this one against players of the most popular sport in America. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. The exchange of words between the leaders of the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea reached a new high this week. The DPRK's foreign minister said the US president had declared war against his country and threatened to shoot down US military planes flying in international airspace. On the domestic front, Mr. Trump is also dealing with the devastation of Puerto Rico caused by 2 hurricanes and another failed attempt to repeal and replace his predecessor's signature healthcare law. Lots to talk about. And for more, we turn to CGTN's Owen Fairclough in our newsroom. And Owen, with so much on his plate, President Trump found the time to criticize American football players. What's going on?
Nathan, that's quite a week, even by Donald Trump's standards, as you say, dealing with the aftermath of a hurricane that's devastated the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico. Not just that, the threat of a full-blown military conflict with the DPRK. But it seems that those attacks by Donald Trump on American football players have ignited a debate like few others, and that's saying something for Donald Trump's young administration. This is something that cuts right to the heart of unresolved issues about how police handle specifically African-American suspects with some very high-profile deaths in custody. And that's really what's generated these protests, those images you're seeing there of American football players kneeling during the playing of the U.S. national anthem before games. Donald Trump has done a lot to feed all this with that incendiary speech at the tail end of last week and subsequent tweets attacking those players who take the knee, as they say, during those games. Now, he was asked today during a news conference standing next to the Spanish Prime Minister if he'd perhaps become too preoccupied with this whole debate at the expense of what many are calling an escalating humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. Here's President Donald Trump.
I was ashamed of what was taking place because, to me, that was a very important moment. I don't think you can disrespect our country, our flag, our national anthem. To me, the NFL situation is a very important situation. I've heard that before about was I preoccupied. Not at all. Not at all. I have plenty of time on my hands. All I do is work. And to be honest with you, that's an important function of working. It's called respect for our country.
Okay, we'll talk more about Trump's response to Puerto Rico in a moment. But, Owen, what about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea nuclear crisis? Trump's been very tough on China, but not today in the Rose Garden, while he was also talking about football.
That's right. There's certainly no let-up, Nathan, in the rhetoric against the DPRK. He described this country as a menace and warned that military action against it would be, in his words, devastating. But he also acknowledged the sanctions, those unanimous sanctions that were passed by the UN, and specifically the preference of China and Russia. Remember, China and Russia want to go down the route of sanctions. And he acknowledged this. He had specifically warm words for China, which remains really the DPRK's most important, and many would say last trading partner with these sanctions that are being escalated against it. As is often the case with Donald Trump, he spent weeks criticizing China for not doing enough to isolate the DPRK, but today was singing a very different tune. Here's President Trump again.
I applaud China's latest action to restrict its trade with North Korea. And in particular, I applaud China for breaking off all banking relationships with North Korea, something that people would have thought unthinkable even 2 months ago.
Okay, and Trump's response to what's been probably the most overlooked item we've got to so far, but the humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico is under scrutiny. Now, Trump's been vaunting his administration's response, but he's also been engaging with the island's crippling debts, hasn't he, on social media and stuff?
Easy to forget, Nathan, that Puerto Rico was a broken economy before this devastating hurricane, this latest one, I should say. An island that's gone bankrupt under more than $100 billion of liabilities that have been stacking up over the last 20 years or so. Many people have been complaining both here in the US mainland and in Puerto Rico that it seems a little bit forgotten when you contrast the speed of the response with Puerto Rico to the speed of the response to those disasters in Florida and in Texas. For Donald Trump, though, there's no let-up for Puerto Rico. It's sagging under these debts. Its infrastructure has been broken. But Trump is essentially saying that Puerto Rico has to honor its debts. He put out a tweet just in the last day or so. Let's take a look at that. He says much of the island was destroyed with billions of dollars owed to Wall Street and the banks, which sadly must be dealt with. So very much reminding Puerto Rico of these liabilities, while the mayor of the capital has said that Washington should really be putting people before debts and asking for some kind of let-up, some kind of grace with all of this. Trump, for his part, though, is happy with the way his administration has responded to Puerto Rico. He's heading there next week. He says there's plenty of aid flowing there, and he thinks the U.S. is doing okay in all of this. Here's President Trump once again.
We are unloading on an hourly basis massive loads of water and food and supplies for Puerto Rico. And this isn't like Florida, where we can go right up the spine, or like Texas, where we go right down the middle and we distribute. This is, a thing called the Atlantic Ocean. This is tough stuff. The governor has been so incredible in his statements about the job we're doing. We're doing a great job.
Well, as I say, Nathan, many Puerto Ricans would dispute that, and there's perhaps a timely reminder that if Donald Trump thinks he's doing okay with Puerto Rico, his domestic agenda, there's a real problem there. For the second time in as many months, his attempts to get through a healthcare reform bill, or a repeal of Obamacare, to be more specific, has failed. Republicans couldn't get enough of their own numbers to back this, and they've had to shelve it. They say for the time being they're going to concentrate instead on trying to reform the tax code, another cornerstone of Donald Trump's pledges as a candidate, and another cornerstone of what he wants to do while he's in the Oval Office. Nathan.
Owen, thanks so much. There was a lot to break down there. Owen Fairclough reporting from our newsroom. Let's get to our panel, because there is a lot to talk about. Here in the studio, Brian Becker. He's an analyst on U.S. DPRK relations. He's visited the DPRK on several occasions. And also from his office across town, my old boss, Simon Marks. He's president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. And in the studio here, we have Morgan Muchnick. He's a Republican strategist and the founder of the M2 Group, a public and government affairs firm. Welcome all. We're going to start with the DPRK. I just came back from New York. We all heard President Trump's speech on the Tuesday, and also the foreign minister's speech from the DPRK over the weekend, and a rare press conference. Brian, the DPRK foreign minister said there that Donald Trump had declared war by saying the DPRK's leadership won't be around for long, potentially. Do you agree with that? Do you think that Donald Trump declared war?
It's not a declaration of war. Of course, only the U.S. Congress can declare war, although it stopped doing that starting at the end of World War II. But the DPRK foreign minister's speech came 1.5 hours after the U.S. Air Force sent the B-1B bomber far up above the 38th parallel along the eastern side of North Korea.
And with F-15 fighters too, yeah. And
15 F-15 fighters. Now, when the U.S. did this in 1969, North Korea shot that plane down. That was, people don't quite remember this. This happened April 15th, 1969, right after Nixon came in, early part of the Nixon administration. 31 airmen were killed. At that time, the U.S. didn't do anything to respond because they were, of course, the U.S. was at that time bogged down in Vietnam. When we have the United States carrying out those kind of provocations, I think time to coincide with the foreign minister's speech. It's very possible, either through a miscalculation or a deliberate decision on the part of the DPRK that they must send a message, they can't permit this. There could be incidents, and those incidents can lead to a real conflict, and that conflict can quickly get out of hand. I think it's not just Trump, but the Pentagon right now is actually playing with fire. Again, I feel that this is an artificially manufactured crisis. North Korea, after all, has had 6 nuclear tests. The United States has had 1,050. Okay. They have 5,000 operational nuclear weapons. North Korea has a few. North Korea doesn't really want a war. We could go in a different direction rather than escalating the rhetoric.
Yeah, what if, for example, North Korean radar locked onto those planes?
Indeed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Simon, you cover the White House. Before we ask you a question, let's hear from Sarah Sanders, the White House spokesperson on this.
We've not declared war on North Korea, and frankly, the suggestion of that is absurd. We continue to seek the peaceful denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. That's our focus, doing that through both the most maximum economic and diplomatic pressures as possible at this point.
Well, that was the response to the Rocket Man accusation, wasn't it? That was the little Rocket Man was the key words in Trump's speech on Tuesday. What do you make of this sort of contradictory statements coming out of the White House and elsewhere in the administration?
Well, I think there's a couple of different things here, Nathan. First of all, with respect to Brian, I'm not sure this is an entirely artificially manufactured crisis. I mean, President Trump did have some truth on his side when he stood side by side with the Spanish Prime Minister a few hours ago and said, look, this problem should have been resolved 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And with that passage of time, North Korea's nuclear capability has developed. So one way or another, eventually you're heading to some kind of standoff. The difficulty here, though, is that Donald Trump some days talks about fire and fury. We're locked and loaded. We're ready to go. It's time to stop talking and time to start taking action. But then today he stands there in the Rose Garden saying essentially that that's not his preferred option and echoing the views of General James Mattis, his defense secretary, that the diplomatic track apparently is not entirely dead. The other critical thing I would say is that the North Korean foreign minister made it very clear, not in his speech, but in his subsequent appearance at the UN microphones, that it was Donald Trump's weekend tweet that had really stuck in Pyongyang's craw. Not so much the speech at the UN that Donald Trump made, but that threat on Twitter to take the North Korean leadership out. Words matter when you're engaged in this kind of a diplomatic standoff,